If you ever find yourself surrounded by an alien fleet demanding something you don't understand, it probably means you already made the wrong choice. The voice echoed through Ryan Hale's cracked comms, low and absolute, as 12 massive warships hovered above him, their hulls glowing like molten glass against the ash-choked sky, targeting systems locked, humming through his bones, his suit flickering at 9% power, oxygen ticking down, every breath sharp and metallic, and still, he didn't move, because behind him, half buried in the red dust, lay the woman he had carried across 7 miles of frozen wasteland, her skin faintly luminous even under the storm, her breathing shallow, almost gone, and he remembered how it started, not with heroism, not with purpose, but with a simple calculation, because scavengers like Ryan didn't save people, they survived them, and when he first saw her, broken beside the wreckage of a downed craft, he thought she was just another score. Rare biology, maybe worth enough credits to buy him a one-way ticket off this dying rock. He even checked her pulse with the back of his glove like he was inspecting cargo, detached, efficient, until her hand moved, weak but deliberate, fingers brushing against his wrist, not pleading, not begging, just holding. And something about that quiet resistance unsettled him more than any threat ever could. The storm howled at -40 degrees, ice slicing across his visor, warning indicators, flashing in cold blue lines. And still he hesitated, staring at a stranger who should have been nothing to him, who should have been profit, not a burden. And when he finally lifted her, it wasn't noble, it wasn't selfless, it was just a decision he couldn't fully explain, her weight light against his arms, her warmth fading through layers of fabric and failing tech, each step through the drifting snow slower than the last, his boots sinking inches deep with every stride, oxygen draining, logic screaming to leave her behind. But he didn't, and now, with the fleet descending and that same voice repeating, "Return the Empress," Ryan's grip tightened just slightly, because somewhere between that first touch and this moment, she had stopped being cargo, and he had no idea what that would cost him next. The wind had died, but the silence felt heavier than the storm ever did, pressing against Ryan Hale's ears as his suit struggled to maintain pressure, every system dimming one by one, the temperature display blinking at -38 degrees Fahrenheit, while his oxygen dropped below 8%. And still he kept walking, one step, then another, the woman in his arms growing colder with each passing minute, her faint glow now barely visible beneath the frost gathering along her skin, her breathing shallow enough that he had to pause sometimes just to make sure it was still there. And he hated that part most, not the cold, not the exhaustion, but the waiting, the wondering if the next second would be the one where she simply stopped, because that would make the decision for him. That would free him from carrying something he never meant to carry in the first place. And yet when her head shifted slightly against his chest, when her fingers tightened just enough to remind him, she was still fighting, he adjusted his grip instead of letting go, his arms burning, his legs heavy like they were filled with sand, each mile stretching longer than the last across a landscape that offered nothing but broken metal and distant shadows, until finally he saw it. A narrow ridge of dark stone cutting through the white horizon, just enough cover to block the wind, just enough to survive another hour, maybe two. And that was all he needed, he told himself, just enough time to figure out what to do next, because selling her was no longer a simple thought. Not after the way she had held on to him without asking. Not after the way she refused to look afraid, even in whatever state she was in. And when he reached the ridge, he lowered himself carefully, setting her against the stone, his gloves trembling as he checked the last of his supplies. One thermal pack, half a ration bar, less than 5 minutes of auxiliary heat. Numbers that would have been easy before, numbers that would have meant survival if he was alone, but now they felt different, heavier, because they had to stretch across 2 lives instead of one. And as he hesitated, staring at the final thermal pack in his hand, her eyes opened, slow, deliberate, glowing faint gold beneath layers of exhaustion, locking onto his with a clarity that should not have been possible. And for the first time since he found her, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady, carrying a weight that did not match her condition. "You should have left me," she said, not as an accusation, not as a plea, but as a simple truth. And Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound fogging inside his helmet as he shook his head once, barely noticeable, before placing the thermal pack between them instead of keeping it for himself. Yeah, he muttered, adjusting his failing suit as he leaned back against the cold stone. I probably should have. The heat from the thermal pack faded faster than Ryan expected, a weak pulse against the growing cold as the ridge around them groaned under shifting ice. The sound low and distant like the planet itself was breathing, and he watched her carefully. The way her golden eyes stayed open longer now, not stronger, but focused, aware, as if she was measuring something he could not see, and it made him uneasy in a way the storm never did. Because danger he understood, but this quiet observation felt different, calculated, and when she shifted slightly against the stone, her movements controlled despite the exhaustion. He noticed details he had ignored before, the subtle patterns along her skin that pulsed faintly with light, the way the air around her seemed to distort for just a fraction of a second with each breath, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer highway, and Ryan frowned, adjusting the cracked display on his wrist as it tried and failed to classify her biology. Unknown. Incompatible, beyond any registry he had access to, which meant one thing. She was not just rare, she was important, and that realization settled heavily in his chest as he leaned back, his own strength draining with every passing minute. You are not from any system I have seen, he said quietly, more to fill the silence than to demand an answer. But she responded anyway, her voice steadier now, carrying a calm that did not match their situation. No, she said, her gaze drifting past him toward the endless white horizon. I am not. And there was something in the way she said it. Not pride, not arrogance, but certainty, like a fact that did not need explanation, and Ryan let out a slow breath, watching it fog inside his helmet again as the oxygen warning blinked at 5%, numbers that should have forced him to move, to leave, to choose himself, but instead he stayed where he was, his hand resting near the empty pack as if it could still offer warmth, and after a moment, she looked back at him, studying his face with an intensity that felt almost out of place. Why did you give it to me? She asked, not accusing, not confused, just curious, and Ryan shrugged slightly, the motion small, tired, because you needed it more. He answered, simple, automatic, the kind of response that did not require thought, and she held his gaze for a long second, her eyes narrowing just slightly as if trying to understand something deeper behind those words, before she spoke again, softer this time. That is not how survival works. And he let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, shaking his head once as he looked out toward the empty landscape. Yeah, he said, voice rough. I am starting to figure that out. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the cold settling in again as the last trace of heat disappeared, leaving only the sound of distant wind and failing systems. Until suddenly his display flickered sharply, a new signal cutting through the static, faint but unmistakable, something approaching, something fast, and Ryan's body tensed instinctively as he pushed himself upright, ignoring the strain in his limbs as he glanced back at her. And for the first time since he had found her, he saw something change in her expression, not fear, not weakness, but recognition. And it made his grip tighten slightly as he looked back toward the horizon, where a distant shimmer began to form, growing brighter with every second. The shimmer on the horizon sharpened into something unnatural, a distortion that bent the pale light around it as Ryan steadied himself against the ridge, his boots slipping slightly on the frost-covered stone while his display struggled to lock onto the incoming signal, range decreasing fast, velocity too controlled to be debris, too precise to be natural, and his pulse slowed in that familiar way it always did before a decision mattered, every instinct telling him to move, to hide, to leave the unknown behind before it became something he could not outrun. But when he glanced back at her, still seated against the rock, her gaze fixed calmly on the approaching glow, he saw no urgency in her expression, no fear, only a quiet expectation that made his chest tighten in a way he did not like. Because whatever was coming, she knew it, and that meant he did not, and that imbalance shifted everything. You recognize that, he said, his voice low as he adjusted the failing seals along his glove, trying to buy himself a few more minutes of warmth. And she did not look at him when she answered, her eyes reflecting the growing light as it expanded across the frozen plain. Yes, she said simply, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have, enough to make Ryan's grip tighten slightly as he pushed himself upright, ignoring the strain that ran through his legs, because standing still was no longer an option, not with something closing in this fast, not with his oxygen dipping below 4%. And yet when he took a step forward, ready to put distance between himself and whatever was coming, her hand moved again, weaker than before but deliberate, catching the edge of his sleeve just enough to stop him, and he froze, looking down at her with a frown that deepened as he tried to understand. "If we stay, we die," he said, the words flat, practical, the kind of truth that had kept him alive this long. But she shook her head slightly, her fingers loosening but not releasing completely. "If you run," she replied, her voice softer now but no less certain, "you will not survive long enough to matter." And something about the way she said it, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple fact, made him hesitate again, the seconds stretching as the light grew brighter, resolving now into defined shapes, sleek outlines cutting through the haze, not one, but several, descending in perfect formation with a silence that felt louder than any engine. And Ryan exhaled slowly, the sound catching in his throat as he looked from the approaching craft back to her, weighing options that no longer made sense, because leaving meant abandoning the only variable he could control, and staying meant stepping into something far beyond his understanding. And yet his feet did not move, not away, not forward, just rooted in place as the first of the vessels broke through the cloud layer above them, hovering just far enough to cast a long shadow across the ridge, the air vibrating softly as systems he could not see adjusted around them. And for a moment, everything held still, the cold, the wind, even his own breathing, until a low frequency pulsed through his suit, translating into a voice that filled the space between them. Calm, measured, absolute. "Return what you carry," said, and Ryan's eyes flicked down to her, still watching the sky, still calm, and he realized then, with a clarity that came too late to change anything, that he had never been the one in control of this situation at all. The voice lingered in the air long after it finished speaking, a low resonance that seemed to settle into Ryan's bones as the massive vessel above adjusted its position by just a few feet, precise, controlled, like it was measuring him rather than threatening him, and his breath slowed as he stared up at it, his mind running through options that all ended the same way, none of them good, none of them survivable. Not with his oxygen barely holding at 3%, not with his suit failing one system at a time, and yet his hand did not move to lift her, did not push her forward, did not comply, because something in the tone of that command felt wrong, not hostile, not urgent, just certain, like it already expected obedience, and Ryan had never been good at following orders that did not make sense. "You hear that?" he said quietly, his eyes still locked on the ship as smaller shapes detached from its underside, descending slowly through the thin atmosphere there. Silhouettes sleek and unfamiliar, and beside him, she shifted slightly, her strength returning in small, measured increments, enough to sit a little straighter against the stone, enough for her voice to carry more clearly when she answered. "I do," she said, and there was something different in it now, not just calm, but authority, subtle but unmistakable, like a current beneath still water, and Ryan glanced down at her, really looked this time, noticing how the faint glow along her skin had grown stronger, how the patterns he had seen before were now more defined, pulsing in steady rhythm, synchronized with something beyond his understanding, and it made his chest tighten again, not with fear, but with the realization that whatever she was, whatever role she played in this situation, it was far bigger than anything he had assumed when he first lifted her from the wreckage. "So what happens if I do not?" he asked, not challenging, not defiant, just honest, and for the first time. She looked at him directly, her golden eyes sharp, focused, carrying a weight that felt almost too large for the fragile body she still occupied. "Then they will wait," she said, and he blinked, caught off guard by the answer, because it was not what he expected, not a threat, not a consequence, just patience, and that made even less sense. Wait for what? He pressed, his voice tightening slightly as the smaller craft drew closer, their presence now visible as faint reflections across the ice. And she held his gaze for a long second before answering. For you to decide. And something in that moment shifted, subtle but undeniable, because the power in the situation did not come from the ships, did not come from whatever force stood behind them. It came from the choice placed in front of him, a choice he had not asked for, a choice he was not prepared to make. And Ryan exhaled slowly. The sound shallow as his oxygen warning dropped to 2%, his body reminding him that time was not on his side, not for long. And yet he stayed where he was, his hand resting lightly against the ground for balance as he looked from the approaching figures back to her, weighing something that had nothing to do with survival anymore, because survival had already been compromised the moment he chose to carry her. And as the first of the smaller craft settled just yards away, its surface shimmering with restrained energy, a doorway forming along its side, without sound, Ryan realized with a quiet clarity that this was not about handing her over, not about following orders, but about understanding why she had never once asked him to save her, and why she had never tried to stop him either. The door of the craft opened without a sound, a clean line of light cutting through the frozen air as Ryan felt the temperature shift by a few degrees, warmer, controlled, artificial, and figures began to emerge one by one, tall silhouettes wrapped in smooth, reflective armor that caught the pale glow of the sky, their movements synchronized, deliberate, not rushed, not aggressive, just precise. And he noticed immediately that none of them raised a weapon, none of them even looked at him as a threat, their attention fixed entirely on her. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because it confirmed what he had started to understand, that he was not the center of this moment, not the problem, not the solution, just the variable. And his oxygen warning dipped again, flashing at 1% now, the edges of his vision tightening slightly as each breath grew thinner, harder to pull. And still he remained standing, his posture steady out of habit more than strength, his gaze shifting between the approaching figures and the woman beside him, who now sat upright without support, her breathing even, her presence no longer fragile but contained, like something vast held in a smaller form. And when the first of the armored figures stopped a few feet away, it lowered its head, not fully, but enough to signal recognition, respect, and the rest followed in silent unison. Emotion so subtle and yet so absolute that Ryan felt it more than he saw it, like gravity shifting around him. And for a moment, no one spoke, no command came, no demand followed, just that quiet acknowledgement hanging in the cold air, until she moved, slow, deliberate, rising to her feet with a steadiness that should not have been possible minutes ago, the faint light along her skin now brighter, more defined, casting soft reflections across the ground. And Ryan took a half step back without realizing it, not out of fear, but because something in him understood that the balance had changed, that whatever he had been carrying was no longer something he could protect or control. And she turned to him then, her gaze meeting his with a clarity that felt sharper than before, more present, more aware. And for a second, the noise of his failing suit, the distant hum of the ships, all of it faded behind that look. "You stayed," she said quietly, and he let out a shallow breath, the sound uneven as he nodded once. "Yeah," he replied, his voice rough. "Looks like I did." And she studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring something beyond words, beyond logic, before her attention shifted back to the figures waiting near the craft, and without speaking, without issuing any command, she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and they moved aside immediately, creating a clear path, their posture unchanged but their response instant, instinctive, like they were reacting to something deeper than orders. And Ryan watched it all with a growing sense of disbelief, his mind struggling to reconcile the image in front of him with the reality he had lived just hours before, dragging her through snow, counting breaths, calculating distance, and now this, a reception that felt less like a rescue and more like a return. And as she reached the threshold of the craft, she paused, just for a moment, her head turning slightly back toward him, not fully, just enough for him to catch the edge of her profile. And in that brief second, something passed between them, unspoken, unresolved, before she stepped inside, the light shifting as the doorway began to close. And Ryan's knees finally gave just a fraction as his oxygen warning flatlined, his vision dimming at the edges, The last thing he saw before everything blurred being the faint glow of that craft lifting silently into the sky, leaving him behind on the frozen ridge, alone, with nothing but the quiet realization that whatever had just happened was not over yet. The cold rushed in the moment his systems failed, not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet, creeping weight that settled into Ryan's chest as his display went dark, the last warning fading into silence. And he dropped to one knee against the frozen ground, his breath shallow, uneven, each inhale thinner than the last, his vision narrowing as the sky above blurred into a pale, distant haze, and for a moment, he thought that was it. No dramatic ending, no final stand, just a slow fade into the same emptiness that had taken so many before him, alone on a world that did not care, and yet something held, something stubborn and human, refusing to let go even as his strength slipped away, and he pressed his hand into the ice beside him, grounding himself, forcing one more breath, then another, the air sharp in his lungs, burning, real, and time stretched in strange ways, seconds feeling longer, heavier, until a new sound broke through the silence, soft at first, then clearer, a low hum that did not belong to the wind, and Ryan's head lifted slightly, just enough to catch the faint shift in light as something descended again, not from above this time, but from the side, close, controlled, and a shadow fell across him, smaller than the massive ships, but precise, deliberate, and the air around him warmed just enough to be noticeable, artificial, intentional, and before he could process it fully, a line of light cut across the ground in front of him, steady, unmoving, like an invitation rather than a command. And Ryan hesitated, his mind slow, his body slower, but instinct still there, still pushing him forward, and he dragged himself an inch closer, then another, until the warmth reached him properly, seeping through the damaged layers of his suit, stabilizing what little strength he had left, and he exhaled, a long, quiet breath that carried more relief than he expected, because someone had come back, not to retrieve her, not to finish what had started, but for him. And that realization settled deeper than the cold ever could, because it meant something had changed, something he did not understand yet. And as the doorway widened, revealing a soft, controlled interior light, he saw a figure standing just beyond it, not armored like the others, not distant, but familiar in a way he could not explain, her presence calm, steady, watching him with the same golden eyes that had once looked up at him from the snow. And Ryan's breath caught slightly as he tried to focus, to make sense of it, because she was different now, not weakened, not fading, but whole, composed, the faint glow along her skin brighter, defined. And yet when she stepped forward, closing the distance between them, her expression did not change, still quiet, still measured, as if nothing about him had surprised her. "You are still alive," she said, not in disbelief, not in relief, but as a simple observation, and Ryan let out a faint, almost humorless breath, his voice barely holding as he answered, "Yeah," before pausing, gathering what little strength he had left. "Looks like you are too." And for a brief moment, something shifted in her gaze, subtle but real, like a flicker beneath controlled calm, before she extended her hand toward him, not commanding, not urgent, just offered, and Ryan stared at it. The same hand that had once barely held on to his sleeve now steady, certain, waiting, and as his own hand lifted slowly to meet hers, he realized that whatever choice he had made back in the storm, whatever reason he had for not letting go, it had followed him here, and it was not done with him yet. Her hand was warm, not in the way of heat packs or failing suit systems, but steady, controlled, like the temperature around her answered to something deeper than environment. And when Ryan's fingers finally closed around hers, the contact felt real in a way nothing else had for hours, grounding, anchoring. And for a brief second the noise in his head faded, the cold, the exhaustion, even the distant hum of the ships above, all of it slipping into the background as she pulled him forward with a strength that did not strain, did not falter, just guided. And he crossed the threshold into the craft with a step that felt heavier than it should have, as if he was leaving more behind than just the frozen ridge and the moment. He was inside, the door sealed silently behind them, cutting off the wind completely, replacing it with a quiet, controlled stillness that pressed gently against his senses, the air clean, breathable, and his lungs reacted before his mind could catch up, drawing in a deeper breath. Then another, each one easier than the last as the systems around him adjusted without instruction, stabilizing him, correcting what his own suit could not. And he leaned slightly against the smooth interior wall, his balance returning in small increments while he looked around, taking in the space that felt less like a vehicle and more like a continuation of her presence. Everything precise, minimal, purposeful, and when his gaze returned to her, standing just a few feet away, he saw clearly now what he had only sensed before, that the fragility he had carried across miles of frozen ground had never been the full truth. That beneath it there had always been something else, something contained, waiting. And she stepped closer again, her movements fluid, unhurried, as if time inside this space followed her rhythm rather than any external measure. And she studied him the same way she had before, quietly, intently, as if measuring not his strength, not his condition, but his choice. And Ryan exhaled slowly, his breath steady now as he pushed himself upright without support, testing the weight of his own body again. "You came back," he said, the words simple but carrying more than he intended, and she inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the statement without making it larger than it was. "I said they would wait," she replied, her voice calm, even, and he let out a faint breath that almost formed a smile, though it did not fully reach his expression, because there were still too many questions, too many gaps between what he knew and what he was seeing, and he looked past her briefly, through a narrow opening where the outside world was still visible, the ridge now small beneath them, the ships above holding position like silent sentinels, and it struck him then how insignificant he must appear in that scale, a single human pulled from the edge of survival into something he did not belong to. And yet when he looked back at her, that feeling shifted, because her attention remained on him, not divided, not distant, but focused, intentional. "So what now?" he asked, not out of defiance, not out of fear, but because the question had nowhere else to go, and she held his gaze for a moment before answering, the faint light along her skin pulsing once, steady, controlled. "Now," she said, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty, "you see what you chose to carry," and Ryan's brow tightened slightly, the words settling in his mind as something more than a statement, more like a door opening into a truth he had not fully stepped into yet. And as the craft began to rise, smooth and silent, lifting them away from the frozen world below, he realized that the distance between what he thought this was and what it actually meant was only just beginning to reveal itself. The craft rose through the cloud layer without a sound, the frozen world below shrinking into a pale scar across the surface of a much larger planet. And Ryan stood near the transparent panel, his reflection faint against the stars as his breathing finally steadied. Each inhale clean, each exhale no longer fighting for survival. And yet the weight in his chest had not lifted, it had only changed, shifting from physical strain into something quieter, heavier, something he could not measure with. A failing display or a percentage warning. And behind him, she moved with calm precision, the faint glow along her skin now fully defined, no longer hidden, no longer restrained. And when he turned, really turned to face her, he saw it clearly for the first time, not the injured woman he had carried, not the fragile figure against the ridge, but something far beyond that, something that filled the space without effort, without force. And the room itself seemed to adjust around her, as if recognizing a presence it had always been built to serve. And the figures he had seen before now stood at a respectful distance along the walls, silent, still, their attention fixed not on him, but on her. And when she stepped forward, they lowered their heads in perfect unison, a motion that was not commanded, not performed, but given. And Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly as the realization settled fully into place, not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet confirmation of everything that had not made sense until now. "You are not just important," he said slowly, his voice steady despite the weight behind it. "You are the reason they are here." And she stopped a few feet in front of him, her gaze level, her posture unchanged, as if the statement did not alter anything that already existed. "I am who they serve," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no arrogance, just truth, simple and absolute. And Ryan let out a slow breath, running a hand briefly along the side of his now stable suit as he processed the scale of what that meant. The ships, the formation, the patience, the fact that an entire fleet had waited, not attacked, not demanded, simply waited, because of a choice he had made without understanding it. And he looked back at her, something quieter in his expression now, something less guarded. "You knew," he said, not accusing, just stating what had become obvious. "You knew I was going to carry you." And for the first time, she did not answer immediately, her eyes holding his for a fraction longer than before, as if considering not the question, but the way it was asked. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but no less certain. "I knew you could," she said, and that difference, small as it was, settled deeper than anything else she had said. Because it was not about prediction, not about control. It was about possibility, about choice, about something uniquely his. And Ryan looked away for a moment, back toward the stars stretching endlessly beyond the glass. The silence between them filled not with tension, but with understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. And after a few seconds, he nodded once, almost to himself, before asking the only question that still mattered. "So what does that make me now?" And when he turned back, she was closer, her presence steady, her gaze unwavering, and the faint light around her reflected in his eyes as she answered. "It makes you the one who carried more than you knew." And the words lingered, not as a reward, not as a title, but as something else entirely, something that did not belong